And we're going to pick up in Job chapter 9 with Job's response to Bildad. Last week we were talking about Job's response to Eliphaz, and I think we pretty well finished up that section through chapter 7. And as we've looked at, we're taking it in sections, of course. And chapter 8 is Bildad's first speech, his first attack against Job, and then picking up in chapter 9. And remember, Bildad talked about that his logic, his charge was that his children had sinned, verse 4 of chapter 8, and that's why they're all dead. And he said, if you were pure and upright, he would rouse himself on your behalf to restore you to your rightful place. So Job, because you're suffering, obviously you have sinned against God. And then his logic for that is in verse 8 of chapter 8. Ask the former generations. In other words, it goes back. Who has ever seen anybody suffering like you that didn't deserve it, that didn't earn this punishment? And we know from chapters 1 and 2, that's not what God saw in Job. So that's Bildad's attack as he is giving his first speech to Job. And now Job is beginning in chapter 9 through chapter 10, verse 22, to give his response to Bildad's statement. And it's really an interesting discourse to look at this little section of Scripture. This is a rich little passage of Scripture. And he chapter 9, verse 1, New International Version, then Job replied. And he gives in the first couple of verses the fact that, I indeed know that this is true. He said, I understand what you're saying. I get this, Bildad. But he then goes on to say, and he talks about the sovereignty of God. And he understands the sovereignty of God, that God is all powerful. God is in control. God sees and knows it all. And he sees the futility of man trying to understand God's greatness. This is from verse 3 through verse 24 of this 9th chapter. And this is rich because Job mentions things that we talk about today. Verse 9, the bear and Orion, the Pleiades, or the seven sisters, constellations of the south. He's talking science, he's talking astronomy here, and he understands that God is great and that God's the ultimate ruler of everything. And this is the basic response that he gives in verse 9 and in verse 22. Look at chapter 9, verse 2. He said, indeed, I know this is true, but how can a mortal be righteous before God? Verse 22. And it is all the same. That is why I say, he, speaking of God, destroys both the blameless and the wicked. He said, I understand God's sovereign. And this is my problem. God is so sovereign that he destroys the wicked, yes, but he also destroys the righteous. And you can almost see him pointing at himself, of whom I am one, because in verse 21 he says, although I am blameless, I have no concern for myself. I despise my own life. And it's all the same. That is why I say he destroys both the blameless and the wicked. Job, you can feel Job approaching in this section, but he can't quite get to the faith needed to see that if God is so great, then his suffering may have a reason in God, and that God is not just out to get him. That's where Job faltered in this, all the way through this book. Job had an unflinching determination, or patience, as James says in James chapter 5. And that unflinching determination is to uphold his integrity. He said, I haven't done anything to deserve this. And I don't understand why God is out to get me. And that's where his problem came. He saw that God was great, but he just couldn't see, well, if God is so great, maybe he's got a plan in this that I don't understand, but he's not out to get me. He is with me. And things are going to be okay. He couldn't reach that place. He could go, here I am. And I know God is great, he's powerful, he just, then he'd fall back down. He just couldn't make that transition to see that, yes, God is so great that obviously he's got a plan for me in this that I don't understand. But he's with me. He's not against me. He's not out after me. And it's going to be okay. He struggled at that point. And we often struggle with that too. I think that's one of the reasons why Job is such a practical book for us when we're facing difficulties. And some of the points that Job raises in his responsibility that God's going to revisit when he speaks to him in chapters 38 through 41. Beginning in verse 25, and as I said, we're not going verse by verse through all this, unless there are verses within this passage that you have read or you are looking at now that you're saying, wait a minute, I got a question about this. Because it would take us to go through verse by verse, we'd probably be looking at another extra 6 months or more in going through. It would be almost kind of redundant in some ways. But in verse 25, Job moves on to talk about his condition. And he reveals again his confusion. Look at what he says in verse 25. My days are swifter than a runner. They fly away without a glimpse of joy. They skim past like boats of papyrus, like eagles swooping down on their prey. If I say, I will forget my complaint, I will change my expression and smile, I'll still dread all my sufferings, for I know you will not hold me innocent. Since I am already found guilty, why should I struggle in vain? Even if I washed myself with soap in my hands with washing soda, you would plunge me into a slime pit, so that even my clothes would detest me. So Job knows that he has done nothing willfully wrong to bring this suffering. But he realizes that man before God is always in a lost situation. He said, I still dread all my sufferings. I know you will not hold me innocent. I have failed, and I've offered sacrifice for that. He was being accused of sin. He said, I've not done anything that I have not confessed, that I have not offered sacrifice for. I don't know of anything I've done, and none of these guys were pointing anything out to him. And that's where his confusion lay. And he realizes that man before God is always in a lost situation. When you think about the bar, and this is the point out of this. When you think about the bar of being right with God by your works, or what you do, or what you don't do, depends on how you define it. The bar, the minimum, is that you've got to be as good as God. If you are going to earn your way into heaven, if you are going to say, I live good enough, the bar, the minimum we have to do is to be from birth till death as good as God. That's the minimum. And Job recognizes, if I try to look at it from that standpoint, there's no way. There's no way man can be righteous before God. And we're always in a lesser spot because God is ultimate perfection. So, as Job talks about this, he recognizes another problem that he has in his pain and pain in general that we can see. Verse 32, He says, he, speaking of God again, is not a man like me, that I might answer him. That we might confront each other in court. He goes to a litigation standpoint here. He said, if only there were someone to arbitrate between us, to lay his hand upon us both, someone to remove God's rod from me. See, he thinks God is out to get him. He doesn't understand why. So that his terror would frighten me no more. Then I would speak up without fear of him. But as it now stands with me, I cannot. Job realizes in his pain, and this is a problem that he has with his pain, that he needs someone to arbitrate between him and God. As one commentator notes, a Micaiah, which is the word for arbitrate, someone that is used in verse 33, New International Version, arbitrate, is not someone who necessarily stands over God and Job in order to judge between them. It's more as one who argues a case. He's a mediator or negotiator who is able to bring parties together. That's what Job is saying. I wish I had this. And verses 33 through 35 show us that at the base, at the foundation of Job's agony and complaining was his search for reconciliation with God in the face of what it seemed to him of God's rejection. If someone was to remove God's rod from me, he sees that he thinks that God has rejected him. And it's interesting here. Remember, Job is at least pre-Abraham. Maybe the actual events took place well before the age of Abraham. But at least Abraham. And at the latest, right around just after Abraham. So we're talking early. This is before the written law. This is before there was an Israel. Before all of this. Job understood the substitutionary power of sacrifice. The innocent standing for and between God and guilty man. He understood that because he offered sacrifices. Remember chapter 1. He sent and sanctified his sons, and he offered a sacrifice that just in case they said something stupid in their minds about God. So, he understood that there had to be a sacrifice. The innocent for the guilty. Genesis 3 laid that out. And that message had continued right on down the line. So somewhere Job lived between Genesis 10 and Genesis 12, we think. But the message of substitutionary sacrifice, the innocent for the guilty, was very real. And Job understood that. But what he's struggling with here, and what he was yet to understand, was the power of that sacrifice, that go-between that would be in Jesus. What Job was saying, I need somebody, because it's so far between me and God, I need somebody who can understand me and understand him and help us both understand each other. He said, I need this. And this was the deficit. He saw sacrifice as being able to, the innocent for the guilty, but he didn't understand what the ultimate would be in Jesus, that is the somebody. The writer to the Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 2, verses 9 through 18, he says, we see Jesus, perfect through suffering, mature through suffering, a merciful and faithful high priest, able to help those who are tempted. This is the wonderful thing, this is what Job was struggling with. He didn't understand that. A lot of people in the Old Testament did not understand. They could see, and they could see like well through glass darkly. But this is what we have in the midst of our problems. For this family that you talked about. They have somebody who understands them and who understands God and can help them understand each other. And this is where we probably, as often as not, we ignore this. Job was calling out for it. We have it in Jesus. But we don't utilize it. Talk to me about how all this is striking your mind. What questions, what statements come up in your mind with this?
Makes me think about Paul says, like you've got to have someone to go before you to God, but we have direct access.
Yeah.
That's what it makes me think.
Yeah. Catholicism, you got your priest, then you got your bishop, then you got your cardinal, then you get your pope, and then the pope talks to Mary, Mary talks to Jesus, and Jesus, you would think you were dealing with U.S. government with all the red tape. And we don't have that. We can go directly to God, Christ Jesus. We can enter boldly, the writer to the Hebrews says, into with confidence. That word boldly means with confidence. We don't have to wonder if we walk behind the veil whether we're going to come out alive or not. We can walk right into the very presence of God because we have somebody that will walk with us. And that somebody is Jesus. The challenge for us is to recognize that and utilize that in the midst of our difficulties. Job missed that. This is where the problem of Job really comes up. Because as you go into chapter 10, he's approaching it, he's close. If he could just get this right here and see that God is not after him, it would have changed Job's whole demeanor. But in chapter 10, verse 1, I loathe my very life. Therefore I will give free rein to my complaint and speak out in the bitterness of my soul. I will say to God, do not condemn me, but tell me what charges you have against me. He just, his lack of understanding and confusion, his suffering and his not being able to grasp this is bringing. His three companions should have helped him to grasp this. For our friends, and when we run into suffering, can we help folks make that transition to seeing that they have somebody, or do we just simply help them fall down the hill? Yeah, it's amazing that Job held on to his integrity. Most of us would have joined hands with the devil and said, yeah, let's curse God, because I don't like what's happened to me. Most of us would have done that. Because like I said, you lose everything you got, lose your whole family at once. One day. And then you're smitten with boils from your head to your feet, bottom of your feet, And yeah, we would have said, okay, devil, you're better than God. I agree with you. I don't like this. Curse God. It's hard for us to make that transition to see that. Job struggled here. He still maintained his integrity. And that's where his confusion lay. He said, I don't understand. Because I know that I have trusted God. I know I have, sacrificed. I know I have kept to the word that I have understood. I don't understand why God is out to get me. That's his basic statement here. Job's confusion is that, he maintains his integrity, but he's still confused. Look at verse 7 of chapter 10. And he's talking about God here in this passage. And he says, Do you have eyes of flesh? Do you see as a mortal sees? Are your days like those of a mortal, or your years like those of a man, that you must search out my faults and probe after my sin, though you know that I am not guilty, and that no one can rescue me from your hand? You know, he's battling with this. And then, beginning in verse 13, really through verse 22, Job leads his confusion. He's just simply going through all this, and it leads into another problem that he has with his suffering. Look at verse 13. I mean, it's pretty powerful that Job is saying this. Remember, he's saying this to God. But this is what you concealed in your heart. And I know that this was in your mind. If I sinned, you would be watching me, and would not let my offense go unpunished. If I am guilty, woe to me. Even if I'm innocent, I cannot lift my head, for I am full of shame and drowned in my affliction. If I hold my head high, you stalk me like a lion, and again display your awesome power against me. You bring new witnesses against me and increase your anger toward me. Your forces come against me, wave upon wave. Why then did you bring me out of the womb? I wish I had died before anyone or any eye saw me. He said, if this is what you knew you were going to do to me, God, why did you let me be born? That's pretty strong. That's pretty strong. And how often, though, have we, maybe not said it, but it has drifted through our mind, Lord, if you knew I was going to go through all this, why did you allow me to get this old? Why did you allow me to be born? If you knew I was going to have this much trouble, and you knew it, nothing's hidden from you, God. Why did you allow me to be born? And as he finishes up this section, his confusion only just multiplies. And he says, this is you can almost, it's a very sad statement. Verse 20. He said, are not my few days almost over? Turn away from me so I can have a moment's joy before I go to the place of no return, to the land of gloom and deep shadow, to the land of deepest night, of deep shadow and disorder, where even the light is like darkness. Almost sounds like he's talking about a black hole. It's like, no light can even. But he's talking about death. And as we read all of this, chapter 10 stands in stark contrast to Job's statement of faith in chapter 2, verse 10. Remember in chapter 2, verse 10, after all that had happened to him, it says that Job did not, curse God, nor did he charge him foolishly. It seems that the longer and deeper the suffering of Job continued, the more he allowed his carnal nature to define his approach to God, and to himself for that matter. And he saw what was happening to him as a rejection by God instead of what it was, a trial for God. Remember, this was a trial for God. Satan had said, God had said, have you considered my servant Job? Satan said, yeah, let me get my hands on him, and I'll show you what he'll do. And God said, okay, go ahead. Take your best shot. And he was taking his best shot. And Job was suffering for God. And one of the most difficult things for a believer to say and believe in their own mind, and whether they're looking at themselves or the suffering of another, is God accomplish all your will. How difficult is that to say? Let's talk about that just a little bit. God, accomplish all your will. How hard is that for us to say?
Well, when things are great, it's real easy to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. When things are woohoo, it's easy to do.
God is good.
God is good.
That's what you say.
Yeah. How easy is that to say?
Well, it's easy to say, meaning it, you know, it can be pretty selfish.
Okay.
You can do it your way as long as it sort of ends up the way I want it to. Meaning it is totally different.
And the thing we have to understand too is that whether we say it, think it, don't say it, God knows what we're thinking and what is in our heart.
Mm-hmm.
He knows.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, sometimes it's scary too, to say, your will be done. Because I know that I've prayed, your will be done, but I always put in there, but don't hurt anybody.
Yeah.
You know? But especially if it's about your kids,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah. When you say, do whatever you have to do,
Just don't hurt anybody.
yeah, then we start putting limits on it.
Yeah.
I want you to do this for me, God, but now A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Don't do that. You know, do how easy is it to say, God, accomplish all your will? It is tough. It is tough. And I bring this up because as we look at Job and we hear all these mournful lamentations that he gives, you think, you know, I come to Sunday school for this? Good grief. You know. But to recognize and to join with Job and see that, yeah, Job struggled. There are times that we struggle. Yeah. Job is written to let us know you ain't the only one that's had a problem understanding where God is. When everything, woohoo, we're all right. But to say it versus mean it, and then it's kind of scary to be able to say it because we don't know what God will do. When we go through our study of Habakkuk, Habakkuk is actually going to do that very thing. He's going to ask God, why ain't you doing something? And God said, yes, I'm going to do something. And Habakkuk says, no, that's not what I'm talking about. When we open up and ask God to move, we need to really mean what we say and understand. That doesn't always mean that God is waiting and say, okay, I just want you to say, accomplish all your will so I can take my big stick out and beat somebody over the head with it. No, that's not what it is. But that's surrender. That is the surrender. That's what Christ said in the garden. He said, if it be your will, let this cup pass from me. He knew what he was looking at. To end a statement with a preposition. He knew at what he was looking. But he still said, not my will, but yours be done. You accomplish all your will. And it took him 3 prayers to do that. 3 times in the garden. Sometimes we don't think about that. He prayed, he had to go 3 times to reach that place in his humanity to say, accomplish all your will. At the end of that 3rd prayer, he come back, you know, he was there. He had made that commitment and told the disciples, okay, time to get up and get going. It's all right. God's going to accomplish all his will, and I'm going to be right there. He's going to do it through me. And it's, you know, it's useful for us to ask the question, how can I learn what I need from this experience as we face the hurt? Because there's something to learn from all of this. Sometimes, depending upon the circumstance, not to be so stupid next time. I drove to Wilmington last Sunday after leaving here, and driving into Wrightsville that night in all the rain, there was people passing me like I was sitting still. I had my flashers on. I had to slow down. That's how, how bad the rain was. People, about 10 miles outside of Wrightsville Beach, there was at least 4 accidents within 2 or 3 miles of people who had hit ponding water because they were driving too fast. Some things we need to learn. Don't be so stupid next time. But there's some things that we need to learn, as in Job's case, that we might be actually going through this from God because he's got something that he wants us to learn that we can share with somebody else and that he will receive glory from it. And it may not even be in this life. It may be in the next that we really understand and we get the full benefit of saying, God, accomplish all your will. I don't understand. I don't like it. It hurts. It stinks. It sucks. Whatever, all that. But you accomplish all your will. That surrender is a challenge. But out of that, we can ask, Lord, teach me what I need out of this experience. Other comments on that?
I think we look at that statement as like we're allowing God to do something, but really that statement's more about us submitting to what God wants. I mean, we can look at it from above God's standpoint, and I think that's the way a lot of people look at it. Is, okay, God, go ahead and do what you got to do. But really, we're underneath that. I mean, I've been there as well. You're looking at it, okay, God, you go ahead and do this. Then realize, no, all along, God was already going to do what he was going to do anyway. It's just a matter of you getting in his mind.
Yeah. And it is a surrender statement. And that's a tough statement to make. We have to take a lot into consideration. But it's a good place for us spiritually to be able to get there.
Well, for me, it's believing in God and just resting in his faithfulness.
Yeah. And as easy as that seems to be, resting is one of the hardest things for us to do as a believer. To rest in God. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And we don't believe it. We think we still, we got to do something about that somehow or other, rather than resting in God. But that, to be able to say that, it does. It causes us to just kind of lean back and say, I don't understand. I don't know what else to do, but I'm going to lean on you, Lord. I'm going to rest on you. And it is a surrender statement that we need in our lives. Beginning in chapter 12, he's going to answer Zophar. We've gone from chapter 10 all the way now to chapter 12. Because Zophar had made his accusation. And Zophar's accusation was that God is so incomprehensible, we can't understand how he works. And really, God has seen all you've done, and it's a surprise he's waited this long to get you, Job. Essentially what he was saying. And Job, opens his response in chapter 12 to that accusation. And you can now begin to see a transition in Job. There's an edge becoming more visible and evident in Job. Then Job replied, chapter 12, verse 1, doubtless you are the people, and wisdom will die with you. But I have a mind as well as you. I am not inferior to you. Who does not know all these things? You can see that he's getting irritated. At this point, everybody's getting on each other's nerves by this point in this. But there's an increasing level of sarcasm in Job. that's revealed in these first 3 verses. And beginning in verse 4, going through verse 6, Job sets the stage for his first angle of response to Zophar. He notes from his own experience now that God's life and that God's and life's response to sinners and believers isn't always balanced out in life. Look at this. He says, verse 4, I have become a laughingstock to my friends. Though I called upon God and he answered, a mere laughingstock, though righteous and blameless. Men at ease have contempt for misfortune as the fate of those whose feet are slipping. The tents of marauders are undisturbed. Those who provoke God are secure. Those who carry their God in their hands. Job notes a fact that we see every day. And it's easy for people without problems to blame those who have. As that is what they were born to, and it's their fault. Do we ever hear that? Do we ever say that? Those without problems, it's easy to look down the nose at those who are experiencing a problem and say, well, if you'd have just done better, you wouldn't be in the condition you're in. You ever do that? I'll let you respond to that in your minds, because if we are like most people, we have, and we do. Let me once again, that bell irritates me, other than when we're going to ring it, that bell's going to irritate me. It sounds like it. Okay, shut up, Bill, it's time to talk. How often, and everybody said amen. I understand. How often have we passed a judgment, a blanket judgment, when we pass by the welfare department? Or we see people in the welfare line, so to speak. Be able to throw something out there that's just a stick of dynamite. You know, I'll light a fuse in a heartbeat. And we make a blanket statement, well, if they just get a job, they wouldn't need that. If they just do better, we wouldn't have to support these sorry people. If they would, never thinking really through what are the circumstances those folks are making. Are there frauds? Yeah. Everybody? No.
The problem there, in my opinion, is that you have some people that abuse the system, so
Yeah.
therefore you group everyone together.
That's what we do.
Easily, when you look at it individually, you
Mhm.
can easily say, oh, this person
Yeah.
justified
Mhm.
to receive it, but these over here,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah, and what we do, we throw that blanket out there. And, and this is what, Job is bringing out in this passage. And this is what he says. He says, men at ease have contempt for misfortune. His companions were not experiencing any misfortune. And they were just passing all kind of judgment on Job. Well, it's your fault. It's your youngin's fault. It's everybody else's. If you had just done better, Job, you wouldn't be in this situation. Men at ease have contempt for misfortune as the fate of those whose feet are slipping. This is what you deserve. You don't do any better, this is what you deserve. And Bildad's going to pick up on this in the second round, and we'll talk about that. And I'll just give you a clue, because we call that karma. You ever use that word? It's karma. As if we're all a bunch of Buddhists. I mean, this is what they were saying. You deserve this, Job. This is what you get. If you did better, you wouldn't have this problem. And I guess that's a good point for us to end. To think about how often do we blanket people and blame them without looking at really what's going on. I've done it. Probably all of us have done it in some form. That doesn't excuse any of us. And Job's statement right here stands as a real mirror to hold up in front of ourselves and say, okay, is this what you're doing in a particular circumstance that you know of? Is this what you're doing with a particular person or a group of people that you are associated with? You know, it's a way of really personalizing it. Is this how you're looking at these other folks? And you really don't know? Interesting. We'll pick up and talk about it some more. We'll move into the second round, probably, maybe next week. Thank you. Thank you, April, for being with us.
Thank you.